You can't get passionate on the screen. It's too complicated. It's too complex.
He was the Aussie everyman who convinced the world to throw another shrimp on the Barbie. She was the New York-trained actress who went from co-star to real-life partner. Together, Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski seemed unstoppable. For 23 years, 3 Crocodile Dundee films, and countless magazine covers, they seemed unstoppable. But in their home, away from the spotlight, things were far from perfect. Now, Paul Hogan is finally opening up about the messy divorce that stunned fans worldwide. He's reflecting on the heartbreak, the pressures of fame, and the battles with the Australian tax office that added fuel to the fire. What drove the split, and how does he look back on it today? Stick around, because what he reveals is surprising and personal. If you think about movie couples that somehow became real-life couples, Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski are probably one of the most memorable. Their story didn't start at some big Hollywood party or a glitzy award show. It actually started in the middle of the Australian outback back in the year 1986, during the filming of Crocodile Dundee. At the time, the movie wasn't some guaranteed hit backed by a huge studio. It was actually a pretty risky project. Paul Hogan, who was already a household name in Australia thanks to The Paul Hogan Show, teamed up with his friend and business partner John Cornell to finance the movie themselves. They raised about 8.8 million Australian dollars by getting more than 1,000 regular people to invest, including some famous athletes and musicians. That kind of setup was almost unheard of for a film that would go on to make history. Now, Hogan wasn't your typical Hollywood newcomer. By the time cameras started rolling, he was already 46 years old and had spent years working as a rigger on the Sydney Harbour Bridge before comedy changed his life. And then along came Linda Kozlowski.
Doing anything? What do you mean by that?
Because she's the active one, you know. She's a New York girl, or originally Connecticut, and I don't pretend to be laid back. I really am. And if it wasn't for her sort of having to get up and go and the energy to go somewhere and do things, I'd sort of like lay around my hammock a little bit, you know, or wander around in the bush or something, or go to the beach.
He's a little bit like an Australian lizard, and he can just sort of lay by the pool all day and bake in the sun and be a real lazy bones. And I'm from New York originally, and I'm kind of hyper and active, so we make a good couple because he relaxes me and I kind of prod him on.
She was very different from Hogan in terms of background. She had gone through the rigorous training of the Juilliard School in New York and was cast as Sue Charlton, the tough and smart reporter in the film. The second they started working together, people noticed the spark. On screen, their chemistry was obvious, and off screen, it didn't take long before rumors started flying that something was going on between them. Hogan was still married to his first wife Noeline at the time, with whom he had 5 kids, so the gossip columns had more than enough to feed on. When the movie finally hit theaters, it wasn't just successful, it blew up. Crocodile Dundee pulled in over $328 million worldwide and became the highest-grossing Australian film of all time. To put it simply, it wasn't just a movie, it turned into a cultural wave. Americans suddenly wanted to know more about Australia, and Hogan himself became the face of the country thanks to both the movie and those tourism commercials where he invited people to throw another shrimp on the Barbie. And right alongside the hype for the movie, people couldn't get enough of Hogan and Kozlowski as a couple. The press followed them everywhere, and before long, their personal lives were overshadowing even the movie's success. Hogan's marriage ended in one of the messiest divorces Australia had ever seen, especially since he and Noeline had already married, divorced, and remarried once before. Just a few months after it all wrapped up, Paul and Linda tied the knot in May of 1990. They had a wedding in the Australian bush, with a marquee, fireworks, and even a crocodile-shaped cake, leaning fully into the Dundee theme that had made them stars. After that, they bought a huge property in Byron Bay called Cedar Springs, about 46 hectares of land, while also spending plenty of time in Santa Monica. From the outside, it looked like they had built the perfect fairy tale life. Red carpet appearances, luxury travel, and a romance that audiences around the world were rooting for. But, as it often happens, the shine didn't last forever.
Well, Paul came up with a good idea, and after he did the second one, everyone said, "Oh, you got to make a third one or a fourth one." And I said, "No, I really don't know where I can take this character. I think, I'm finished." And then he must be on Australian outback time, because something like 13, 14 years later, he came up with an idea for a third one.
By the time the calendar flipped into the 2000s, things had already started shifting for Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski, though at first it wasn't obvious. Paul had tried a few film projects after the big Dundee success, but most of them didn't really stick, and when Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles came out in the year 2001, it didn't land the way everyone hoped. For Linda, that was kind of the last straw. She'd been getting frustrated for a while because most of the roles offered to her were exactly the same. Basically, the girlfriend to some funny guy. And she wasn't excited about doing straight-to-video movies that, in her words, were so bad they were giving her an ulcer. By the time she hit her 40s, she was done with all that. What she really wanted was something totally different: family, stability, and to just step away from that Hollywood grind. And that's what she did. When their son Chance was born in the late 90s, 1998 to be exact, Linda leaned fully into being a mom. She stayed home with him in Los Angeles, while Paul was still jetting around, going on talk shows, attending events, and promoting whatever project was on his plate. From the outside, it may have still looked like a glamorous setup, but inside the relationship, the distance was quietly building. Paul missed being back in Australia, surfing in Sydney, and enjoying the laid-back lifestyle he'd grown up with. Linda, meanwhile, felt stuck and a little isolated in California, far away from her roots and even further away from Paul's. Later on, she would admit in interviews that when it came down to it, they just didn't have much in common anymore. But it wasn't just emotional distance that pulled them apart. Around the early 2000s, Paul got caught up in something that made their lives a whole lot harder. In the year 2003, the Australian Taxation Office launched what became known as Operation Wickenby. Basically, they accused Paul of dodging taxes and claimed he owed this massive amount. Some reports said as much as $150 million in taxes and penalties. Imagine having that hanging over your head for nearly a decade. No charges were ever officially filed, but the headlines were brutal. Things hit rock bottom in the year 2010 when Paul flew back to Australia for his mother's funeral and was suddenly served with a departure prohibition order. That meant he wasn't allowed to leave the country. Overnight, he was being called a tax evader in the press, and Paul even compared the tax office to the Taliban. Eventually, the whole thing was settled privately in the year 2012, but the stress of it all left a huge mark, not just on Paul, but on his marriage too. By the time 2013 rolled around, the cracks couldn't be ignored anymore. In October of that year, Linda filed for divorce, using the term irreconcilable differences, which, if we're being real, was just a nice way of saying they had been living in separate worlds for years. They kept things as civil as possible, and Paul's manager even called it very, very amicable. But there's no escaping the sadness that comes with that kind of ending. Linda asked for primary custody of Chance, who was about 15 at the time, along with some spousal support. Tabloids splashed around headlines about a $40 million settlement, but in reality, it was closer to about $6.25 million Australian dollars. Linda also kept their Los Angeles house so Chance could finish school without his life being totally uprooted. And just like that, what had once been one of Hollywood's favorite fairy tales wrapped up quietly, with some paperwork and a whole lot of unspoken history. When Paul Hogan talked about his divorce, he didn't hold back. He said the secret to love and women is that if you're lucky, you find a good one and they stick around. And if you're really lucky, they stick around for a long time. But if not, you move on. He described the first year after splitting from Linda as feeling like he was walking around with his skin inside out, where even a simple, well-meaning question like, "How are you holding up?" felt like a punch to the chest. For a guy whose career was built on that easygoing Dundee grin, even watching his own films became painful because they reminded him of a life that was gone. Now, Hogan's not the type of guy who's big on therapy. That's just not really how he grew up. Instead, he leaned on his older kids, the ones from his first marriage, and spent a lot of late nights on the phone, just trying to make sense of it all. But as if the emotional toll wasn't enough, he soon found himself dealing with something even tougher, a pretty scary health problem. Doctors discovered he had a rare condition called retroperitoneal fibrosis. Basically, it was a growth pressing against his abdominal aorta and even affecting his kidney. The treatments he went through were rough, and he admitted it left him weak and gaunt, saying at one point he had lost almost all his body fat, and even his muscles shrank down. He joked, in that very Australian way, that his son Chance had to help him open jars because he couldn't do it himself anymore. But jokes aside, it was serious stuff, and eventually he needed a pacemaker fitted, which left him saying he felt like he was held together by a string. One of the tougher moments during all of this was when he reached for his phone from a hospital hallway and texted Linda just out of habit. That was when reality really hit him. This wasn't his partner anymore. The woman who used to know how he liked his coffee wasn't in that role, and he had to accept that things had shifted to a different kind of distance. For Hogan, that's when the idea of the marriage being truly over sank in, not just finished, but in his words, archived. So, what did he do with all that weight? Like a lot of creative people, he turned it into work. He started writing a script about a magician who could make his pain vanish on stage but couldn't get rid of it in his personal life. And when people asked him if he was bitter about how things ended, his response showed a kind of wisdom you only get with age. He said bitterness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other guy to die, and that he was too old to waste time on bad wine or bad feelings. He didn't like the headlines that framed the marriage as a failure either. To him, lasting as long as they did, especially in Hollywood, was actually a win. Still, he admitted that the ache never completely went away. It was more like an old football injury. You don't notice it every day, but when the weather changes, you definitely feel it. While Paul Hogan was trying to figure out life after divorce and dealing with his health struggles, Linda Kozlowski was already starting a whole new chapter. On a trip to Morocco, she met a local tour guide named Moulay Hafid Baba, and the connection between them grew quickly. Instead of heading back into the Hollywood spotlight, Linda decided to lean into something completely different. Together, she and Moulay started a boutique travel company called Dream My Destiny, which was all about creating one-of-a-kind travel experiences for people who wanted more than just a bus tour or a photo stop. By the time they tied the knot in the year 2017, Linda had officially made Morocco her permanent home, and Hollywood was firmly in her rearview mirror. Now, what's interesting here is that Paul didn't react with bitterness or jealousy. In fact, when asked about Linda's new marriage, he kept it short and simple. "I hope she's happy." Friends close to him said he genuinely meant it, and for a guy who had been through all the ups and downs of fame, divorce, and health scares, that calm response really says a lot. Meanwhile, Hogan himself settled into a quieter lifestyle back in Sydney, renting a modest flat and stepping away from the whirlwind of Hollywood. He wasn't chasing the next big role or looking for another blockbuster. His focus was family, especially his youngest son, Chance. For years, he actually stayed in Los Angeles mostly for Chance, who at the time was fronting a punk band called Rowdy P and figuring out his own path. Hogan admitted in 2019, "I'm only living in Los Angeles because he's not ready for me to leave." That tells you exactly where his priorities were. He also used that time to reconnect with his 5 children from his first marriage, and he threw himself into being a grandfather. Hogan often said that laughter was the best medicine, and instead of finding comfort in self-help books or retreats, he found it in family dinners, grandkids' antics, and those small everyday moments that don't make headlines but mean the most. As for Linda, she splits her time now between her luxury riad in Marrakesh and occasional visits to Los Angeles. Paul eventually returned to Australia for good, still battling some health issues, but enjoying the slower pace that comes with semi-retirement. Their son Chance continues to be the thread that keeps them connected, and they've been spotted more than once sharing a casual family meal. Even Moulay and Paul have shaken hands at birthdays, proving that blended families can actually work when people let go of grudges. So, the fairy tale couple of the 1980s may be gone, but what replaced it was something a little more grounded: 2 people who built separate, fulfilling lives on different continents. And honestly, that might be the real happily ever after. But what did Hogan take away from all of this? When people look back at Paul Hogan's life, especially his relationship with Linda Kozlowski, they often focus on the fame, the divorce, or the headlines. But what really sticks with Hogan himself are the lessons he pulled from it all, and over time, he's been surprisingly open about them. One of the first things he came to believe is that divorce doesn't automatically mean failure. To him, it's more like reaching the end of a chapter, a finish line of sorts, where you just accept that the book you were writing together has run its course. He and Linda always made it clear that their son, Chance, would never get caught in the middle of the media circus, and both of them stuck to that promise. In Hollywood, where kids often get dragged into the spotlight, that decision says a lot. Another lesson Hogan talks about is vulnerability, which wasn't something he grew up comfortable with. He used to think keeping a tough exterior was the way to handle problems, but after his split, he realized that opening up doesn't make you weak. He even joked about it in his own Aussie way, saying, "Tears won't rust your ute." But beneath the humor was a real point. Bottling things up only makes life harder. What surprised him most was how many men came up quietly, sharing their own stories of heartbreak and loneliness. That stuck with him, and while he doesn't make a big show of it, he's been known to support mental health charities in hopes that others won't feel as isolated as he once did. He also learned the hard way that money has its limits. Sure, the tabloids love to speculate about the divorce settlement numbers, throwing around figures as if they told the whole story. But Hogan pointed out that no amount of cash replaces the little things, like 2 decades of shared holidays or the memories built over time. When asked about regrets, he said he wished he had spent more time actually talking, really listening. instead of letting assumptions fill the gaps. Success, he admitted, can sometimes pull people apart if you let it become the focus. That's a reminder a lot of people can relate to, whether you're in show business or not. For anyone going through something similar, Hogan's advice is surprisingly simple. Let yourself grieve, appreciate the good moments, and then move forward without expecting some perfect sense of closure. Life doesn't always tie up in neat little bows, and that's okay. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. Sometimes even the most public love stories deserve a quiet, respectful postscript. What do you think? Should stars share more about their private lives, or do they deserve to keep it completely off the record? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit subscribe because we've got plenty more real stories from behind the spotlight coming your way.